Lucia Joyce was the only daughter of James Joyce, the author of Ulysses, and one of the most significant writers of the interwar period. Lucia was a noted beauty and a talented dancer, but in the 1930s, her mental health began to go downhill. After this, she was locked away in asylums for over 50 years, and was then written out of history. Join me as we explore her story. Lucia Anna Joyce was born on the 26th of July 1907 in the port town of Trieste in the northeast of the Kingdom of Italy. This small city is located on the Adriatic Sea, near the modern-day border between Slovenia and Italy, but back then it bordered the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It is impossible to understand Lucia's life story without exploring who her parents were. Her father was James Joyce, an Irishman who became one of the most influential literary figures of Europe in the 20th century. He authored works such as Dubliners and A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. However, his most famous work was Ulysses. Joyce is widely regarded as having established many of the elements of avant-garde literature and modernism. Lucia's mother was Nora Barnacle, a woman from a poor family in Galway in the west of Ireland, but who had moved to Dublin when still a child. She met Joyce there in 1904 and they began a relationship. Despite the fact that Joyce's works were nearly always set in Dublin in Ireland, the pair left the island within a few months of meeting each other and would never return for any sustained period of time, establishing their home in Trieste. Lucia's older brother Giorgio was born there in 1905 and she followed 2 years later. After Nora suffered a miscarriage in 1908, she would not have any further children. The small family lived during Lucia's early years in Trieste. At this time, Joyce was not an established writer, and it was a precarious existence for them, with the family often surviving on small bequests from patrons that James acquired, such as Ettore Schmitz, a writer himself who believed Joyce had potential. But it was a difficult period. When Lucia was born, Joyce was recovering from rheumatic fever, which had incapacitated him for weeks. This caused him to briefly give up alcohol, which he was a heavy partaker of for most of his life. Although Lucia's first years were spent in Trieste, she was too young to remember the period. Consequently, her most formative years in the 1910s were experienced as an itinerant literary family. The Joyces briefly returned to Ireland, for instance, in the early 1910s, as Lucia's father attempted to acquire a position at University College Dublin teaching Italian. When this failed, they returned to Trieste. Shortly after this, James did acquire some success with the publication of Dubliners, but the outbreak of the First World War in the late summer of 1914 made living in Trieste increasingly hazardous. These dangers only got worse for the Austro-Italian border town after Italy entered the war against Austria-Hungary in May 1915. When Italy entered the war, the Joyces left Trieste and moved to Zurich in neutral Switzerland. They would live there for the remainder of the war before briefly returning to Trieste again in the late 1910s. It was a disruptive amount of moving around for a child, and by the end of it, as Lucia was entering her teenage years, she was already developing a strained relationship with her parents, particularly her mother Nora. Her early years had also made Lucia something of an international citizen. She grew up to be multicultural, and despite her Irish parentage, considered Italian to be her first language. Another peculiar feature of her upbringing was that her parents were not actually married, an unusual arrangement in the early 20th century. They would only finally marry in a London registry office in 1931. As we will see, her family troubles and relationships would play a role in her life choices and mental health. Unfortunately for Lucia, during the 1930s the tools for addressing these problems were limited, but today they are just a few clicks away. If there is something interfering with your happiness or preventing you from achieving your goals, then today's paid partner BetterHelp could be perfect for you. I recently tried BetterHelp and it let me reflect on specific problems in my life and how I can get through them. We all have ups and downs, and a therapist to help you through it can be a great support. Starting therapy can be hard. Maybe you're too busy, can't find a therapist that works for you, or perhaps you find the face-to-face interaction uncomfortable. Whatever it is, BetterHelp connects you with a credentialed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. You'll be able to schedule therapy sessions at a time that's convenient for you, and however it's most comfortable for you, whether this is a phone call, video chat, or even via messaging. To get started, you fill out a questionnaire to help assess your specific needs, and in about 48 hours you'll get matched with your therapist. If you feel like you don't click with this therapist, you can easily switch to a new therapist at no additional cost. If you think you might benefit from therapy, consider BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/forgottenlives. Clicking this link helps support the channel, and it also gets you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp, so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you. In 1920, Lucia's life and that of her brother and parents finally began to take on a note of greater stability when they moved to and settled in Paris. The Joyces would live here for the most part over the next 20 years, only eventually relocating when the Second World War led them to depart again for Zurich. However, while Paris brought initial stability, it was also here that Lucia would experience the first emergence of her mental health problems. These were exciting years in Paris. After the trauma of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic which followed it, the 1920s were a time of great economic growth and cultural revival in Europe and the Americas, and the French capital was the epicenter of this. The 1920s consequently became known as the Années Folles in France, the crazy years, as writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway and Gertrude Stein made the city their home for periods of time. Lucia's father was emerging as one of the most successful and prominent writers of the era, following the publication of Ulysses in serialized form in the late 1910s. Owing to this, the Joyce home became a retreat for the gathering of many famous literary and cultural figures in 1920s Paris, and Lucia grew up around people such as Pablo Picasso, Erasure, Stein, Hemingway, and the Russian composer Igor Stravinsky. We might speculate that growing up in such an environment brought certain pressures to bear on her, the need to achieve something from a cultural perspective, while surrounded by so many overachievers. Much of this was channeled in her early adult years, in her career as a dancer. Lucia first began dancing in 1922 when she was 15 at the Dalcroze Institute, yet it wasn't until 1925 when she was nearing her 18th birthday that Lucia began training in a more serious manner. Her family's position within the cultural world of Paris in the 1920s afforded her connections with some of the leading ballet and contemporary dance instructors of the day. These included Raymond Duncan, a dance instructor, poet and artist, who was also the brother of the more famous Isadora Duncan, an American who was one of the leading pioneers of contemporary dance. Lucia also trained for a time under Margaret Morris, an English dance pioneer who had become acclaimed for introducing Celtic and Scottish elements into contemporary dance movements. She also started the first modern dance school in the English West Country back in the late 1910s. Today, charges of being a nepo baby would be levelled at Lucia for benefiting from her father's cultural connections, but there is no doubt that she was good. By 1928, she was accepted into a dance troupe called Les Six de Rhythm et Couleur, the Six of Rhythm and Colour. The sextet performed in the year that followed in Paris, Vienna and Berlin, while in 1929, Lucia was runner-up at the first International Festival of Dance held in Paris that year. After witnessing one of her performances during this period, a writer for the Paris Times remarked that Lucia Joyce is her father's daughter. She has James Joyce's enthusiasm, energy, and a not yet determined amount of his genius. When she reaches her full capacity for rhythmic dancing, James Joyce may yet be known as his daughter's father. But just as her career as a dancer was taking off, it came to a shuddering halt. In late 1929, Lucia suddenly abandoned her career as a dancer, telling her friends that she was not physically strong enough to continue as a dancer. The exact reasons for her decision have been a matter of considerable debate, with some historians suggesting that it was her father who put a stop to her career. Apparently, Joyce believed that his daughter's dancing career was too physically demanding and was causing Lucia lots of stress, worsening the already very difficult relationship between Lucia and her mother. It was around this time that she began a relationship with Samuel Beckett, an Irish writer living in Paris who was briefly her father's secretary. He would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Literature many years later in 1969. Their relationship was short-lived as Beckett was involved with another woman and told Lucia that he was more interested in her father and his writing than he was of her. Lucia's decision to quit dancing, combined with the collapse of her relationship with Beckett, led to a dramatic decline in Lucia's mental health in 1930. Joyce would write to Harriet Shaw Weaver, one of his patrons, regarding this, stating that this led to a month of tears as she thinks she has thrown away 3 or 4 years of hard work and is sacrificing her talent. Things deteriorated further in the early 1930s. The exact nature of Lucia's malady is a point of contention, though there appears to have been elements of schizophrenia involved. At one point she was sent to Switzerland, where she spent time at the Burg-Helsley Psychiatric Clinic in Zurich, where the family had lived in the mid-1910s, and where James Joyce still returned on occasion for treatment for his prematurely failing eyesight. There, Lucia was treated for a time by Carl Jung, the great psychoanalyst who had trained under Sigmund Freud, and later emerged as a rival to his mentor. These were strained years, with Lucia often suffering from violent outbursts which manifested towards her family, and her mother in particular. Lucia's deteriorating psychological state came to a head in 1935 during a visit to some relatives in the town of Bray south of Dublin in Ireland. During the holiday she lit a fire in the middle of the living room of her cousin's home and tried to unbutton the trousers of several male visitors to the house. She was also known to open the gas tap at night, flooding the house with the fumes until someone awoke and turned it off again. To cap things off, she then disappeared from Bray altogether and eloped to Dublin, where she spent nearly an entire week sleeping in doorways. Perhaps unsurprisingly, when she returned to Paris and her parents learned the full extent of what had occurred, they decided to have her committed to an asylum in Ivry-sur-Seine, on the outskirts of the French capital. Lucia would spend most of the next 15 years at Ivry, though she was sent for a time to St Andrew's Hospital in Britain for assessment. Her father and brother Giorgio would visit her at Ivry on Sundays over the next several years, but there is no record that her mother ever saw her again after she was committed. James was evidently very troubled by her condition, and the character of Mama Lujo in his 1939 novel Finnegan's Wake is likely based to some extent on Lucia. The visit stopped in the summer of 1940 when the Joyces fled Paris in the wake of the Nazi invasion of France and settled in Zurich in Switzerland. James died there just 6 months later, while Lucia's mother lived for another decade in the Swiss city before her own death. In 1951, Lucia was transferred from Ivry in France to St Andrew's Hospital in Northampton in England, where she had been examined back in the mid-1930s. She would spend the rest of her life here. This was on the request of Harriet Shaw Weaver, an English political activist and literary figure who had patronised her father James in years gone by, and who agreed to become Lucia's guardian in 1951, following the death of Lucia's mother. She often had visits from friends and acquaintances who had known the Joyce family in the 1920s and 1930s, including Harriet, who was aging by then. Chief amongst them was Samuel Beckett, her former suitor from the early 1930s, and her father's close literary acquaintance. By then, Beckett was a successful author himself, and when Weaver died in 1961, he financed her continuing care at Northampton. Meanwhile, her brother Giorgio only visited her once in 1967. Lucia died from complications arising from a stroke on the 12th of December 1982, aged 75. She was the last surviving member of her family, Giorgio having died 6 years earlier. Following Lucia's death, her nephew Stephen took most of her writing and destroyed it. This included her correspondence with her father and apparently some poetry in a novel she had written. It seems as if her family tried to destroy any trace of Lucia. Her medical records were burnt, and Carl Jung had also destroyed all his notes in relation to his time with Lucia. Friends and acquaintances of the Joyce family were also encouraged to destroy any correspondence to do with Lucia, acting like she had never existed and erasing her from history. She was buried in Kinsthorpe Cemetery near St Andrews, where a ceremony near her grave is held each year on Bloomsday, a festival celebrating her father's greatest work, Ulysses. Plans have been brought up in recent years to have the remains of the Joyces repatriated to Ireland, while several books have appeared in the early 20th century, reclaiming Lucia's story from obscurity. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Lucia Joyce. I hope you found it interesting. If you have any suggestions, be sure to leave them down below in the comments, and I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.